Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Conversations with History. In this episode, we're going to cover the Age of Reason, the Great Awakening, the French Indian War, and the American Revolution. You probably remember back to last week, we covered the maturation of the American colonies in North America, at least. And this week, we're going to look at some of the influences that led us to the independence movement. So the first thing we want to cover is some of these new ideas coming out of Europe that have people thinking a little bit differently about politics later on. Earlier, it was more of a movement just for thought. You know, how do we think about the world? And then, of course, that has implications for how we organize our government. In the previous episode, we talked a little bit about the English Civil War and how in the English Civil War, the British did something that for a very long time had not happened. They killed one of their kings, and they didn't do it in battle. They kind of arrested him and charged him with treason and killed him. So the whole English system of government is kind of up in the air at this point, and one philosopher who comes out of this and is shaped by this is Thomas Hobbes, right? And he gives us this idea of a state of nature and a social contract theory. So I'm joined by my astute colleague, a different astute colleague from some of the previous episodes. This is Jeff Robinson. How long have you been teaching American history?
This will be my 24th year.
Okay, 24 years. So hopefully between the two of us, we can do this topic justice. So social contract theory, what does that mean? Just a layman's definition, what is social contract theory?
Well, you take the idea of a contract, of an agreement between two parties where one party is pledging to do something for the other party, and you apply it to the government. In this case, the government is signing the contract for the people to protect the people's rights.
Okay, right. And Hobbes, he argues that the people give up certain rights when this contract is signed. So they give up certain rights. And specifically, one thing that's different about Hobbes than later on we see Rousseau with the social contract, Hobbes believes that once you give it up, you can't take it back. And that's the big difference. He believes this idea of the state of nature, that without government, what you have is, he says, life would be nasty, brutish, and short, in his own words, and it would be a war of all against all, is how he describes it. He says everyone would just be at war with each other all the time, neighbor against neighbor. So we sign away our rights to this sovereign power, and after we do that, we got to sleep in the bed that we've made. And that's why he says you can't just go around willy-nilly cutting off the king's head, because what you end up with is what England experienced afterwards, which was chaos. It was. Right? Which was so bad that they ended up bringing the king back. Not the same one.
His son.
His son.
The restoration.
Right. So so that's kind of the beginning of it. The next one is John Locke with natural rights. So what is, and we hit on this a little bit in the previous episode, but the idea of natural rights, kind of try to explain to the listener what does it mean to have natural rights, and how is that different from the way people viewed human rights before?
Well, natural rights that you're born with that can never be taken away. Life, liberty, property, according to Locke. Of course, we'll hear that in a little bit different form later on from Thomas Jefferson, but had a couple of liberties there. But natural rights.
And before that, people were not, as Thomas Jefferson will later say, people were not all created equal, right? That there were social stations that people had, and those social stations went from slave all the way up to king. And along with those social stations went certain responsibilities and duties. What was your right to do was associated with your social station. John Locke takes this idea of the state of nature from Hobbes, and he says, well, in a state of nature, everyone's free. and no one is above anyone else, and no one has the power in a state of nature to legislate for anyone else. But once we enter into a social contract, then we have to change that. There has to be someone there to legislate. Not everyone can't legislate for themselves, or you're back to the state of nature. So Locke says, actually, in a state of nature, we have these perfect rights, these perfect freedoms, and some of them can't be taken away even under the social contract, those being life, liberty, and property. Rousseau, a French thinker, a little bit later on, he takes Hobbes' idea of social contract, and he actually reverse engineers it and says that the social contract in many ways has created the problems that we see, that if we had just stayed in a state of nature, everything would have been better. He says, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. That's his famous line. But he does agree that there has to be some sort of government. And so he says, because we want to stay as close to the state of nature as possible, we're going to stress the will of the people. And that's where we kind of get this term that was also used by Hobbes, but in a different way by Rousseau, the commonwealth, the common will of the people. And then, of course, finally, Montesquieu. This is a huge one, separation of powers. What does that mean to us as Americans? What did it mean to, it might have meant something a little bit different to them, but in the American consciousness, this separation of powers is huge for people who study our government.
Well, it simply means you're not going to take all the powers of government and put them in the lap of one group or one person. You're going to separate those powers out, and you're going to have a system that can check the power of each of those powers and make sure that neither of the powers become more powerful than the other.
Right. And so by having this kind of separation of powers, we ensure that no one group or no one person becomes so powerful that they can overturn the powers of the others. And in England, they had a very strong idea of separation of powers, but it was a little different because they saw the separation of powers as being the king, the aristocracy, and the common people. And most often, the king was seen as, when he wanted to do something like raise taxes or go to war or something like that, he would appeal not to the aristocracy, but to the common people. So there was often just like, it's weird because it's almost the same way we see the presidency after Andrew Jackson, that the presidency is the voice of the people, not this kind of cabal in Washington of these aristocratic politician types, that the president speaks directly to the people and the people speak directly to the president. That's kind of the same way that the British people saw their relationship with the king. And of course, the king in the Glorious Revolution was not overthrown by the common working person. He was overthrown by a very small group of landowning aristocrats who didn't want a monarch to exert too much power over their country. So this brings us finally to the Glorious Revolution, and this will kind of springboard us into talking about British North America. So what happens during the Glorious Revolution, and why is it important for American history? What occurs during the 1688 Glorious Revolution?
Well, there's a overthrow of the government, bloodless revolution.
That's a key. Bloodless revolution. What do you mean by that?
I mean, there was no bloodshed. There was no true civil war. The king was replaced.
Right. He was pretty much asked to leave and replaced with it was mainly because he was a Catholic and they wanted a Protestant king. So they get William of Orange, who was kind of not the king of the Netherlands, but he was called like a stadtholder. He was effectively he had a princely title. He wasn't a king, but he ran the Netherlands. And so they bring him over to England to become the new king of England because he's a Protestant. And what happens when they have this transition is Parliament becomes more powerful and they start to really work on England and not focus so much on the empire. And we get something that's called salutary neglect, which it'll be on a slide later. But what does that mean? I know this is something you talk about in class. What is salutary neglect of the colonies?
It was a hands-off approach to dealing with the colonies. I mean, they were going through their own problems on the island, and they had a lot of things to work through. Those colonies were doing what they should for the British Empire. They were making money hand over fist, and they left them alone to govern themselves. It was self-government.
Right. And so this 1688-89 date is kind of where we put the beginning of salutary neglect, where they stop trying to enforce royal charters, really. And for the next, 70 years, that's what we get in America. This kind of coincides with what we talked about last week with how the colonies mature into what they were in 1750. So let's talk about, we talked about political changes. So we've got reason and these new ideas about government coming from Europe. But another thing comes from Europe called George Whitefield. And we get this great awakening. So this idea of a religious revival. And so last week in the previous episode, we talked about how the religion of the Americas was very ardent in some places and not in others. So in New England, religion very strong. In the middle colonies, religion very strong. You have the Quakers, you have lots of German Lutherans and different religions. In Maryland, you have Catholicism until the English Civil War. It's the Catholicism, the haven for Catholics in Maryland is overthrown. Of course, the Catholics still live there and they still practice Catholicism, even if it's not technically legal. But what we do see as a result of this, as Coach Robinson said, this result of the economic impact of the colonies, that money was the driving force behind most of the activity in the colonies, even in New England. By 1700, people in New England were not mainly concerned with going to church like they had been in 1620. It wasn't, by 1700, they weren't pilgrims anymore. They were second, third generation people born in America, and they were merchants. The economy of New England was booming, and not to the extent in total dollars or pounds that the economy of the Chesapeake or the South was, but they weren't going to church. Church rolls were dropping. Church attendance throughout the colonies drops drastically from 1700, beginning in about 1680 to 1700. People are just not going to church. And so in the late 1730s and early 1740s, we get this idea of revival. So, I want to know what revival is. I want to quick, not necessarily a quick definition, but what's that mean? What does it mean to have revival?
To bring back. And that's what Jonathan Edwards, he was a Puritan minister, and he felt like the people had lost their way. They had lost the original Puritan vision of building a city upon a hill. They've lost that. They want to revive that. They want to get that back, bring it back alive.
Right. And so what's the what's the difference? What's the difference between Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and all these other preachers? I mean, there were still preachers preaching every Sunday, right? So what's George Whitefield do that's different? How does he convince people that they do need to turn back to God?
Well, he's going to lead. He's going to travel throughout the colonies. He's going to give thousands and thousands and thousands of sermons. Mm-hmm. He's going to reach multitudes of people.
Right, and he does that by circuit riding.
Yes.
By riding, he goes all the way from Boston, Massachusetts to Charleston, South Carolina. He speaks outdoors. He's kicked out of certain places. They're like, we don't want you here. So he just goes outside. And we still in America today have this tradition of, which was brought back up in the Second Great Awakening, which mm-hmm. we'll talk about later in another episode. But this idea of this outdoor revival, I still know people, and I've been to several outdoor revivals where you have preachers come from other places to mm-hmm. and to speak, and that was brought about by George Whitefield. And I was reading the other day, in 1741, he spoke in Boston Common to 20,000 people, which at the time, the population of Boston was 17,000, right? So this man was getting crowds that, and of course, his publicist in America, Benjamin Franklin, who was not, by all accounts, he was not a devout Christian. Ben Franklin was not if he was a Christian, he didn't profess to be part of this church or that church or any denomination of Christianity. And even he said that he believed that George Whitefield was sincere and that he felt like he wanted to help people.
Just a quick note here about Whitefield. He said to have given 18,000 sermons in his lifetime. If you think about that, that's one sermon a day for 55 years. So, I mean,
yeah. He was.
That may bring revival.
Right. That might bring some people back to God if you preach to them every single day. So now, George Whitefield, during this module, you'll read an excerpt from a Whitefield sermon, and it is very it's very charismatic. He talks about he doesn't necessarily try to frighten people, but he gives them his view of the afterlife, which is a dual choice, that you have heaven and hell and that you have to choose. Jonathan Edwards, much the same, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he tells people, you are being held up above the fires of hell by a just God, and if you don't turn back to him, then you'll be cast into the fire. And that resonated with people. And not only did it resonate with people, but lots of historians kind of agree that the Great Awakening formed a uniquely American type of Christianity, what we might today call evangelicalism, which just doesn't really exist in any other country. And because of Whitefield and the Great Awakening and the expanse of this evangelical kind of revivalistic religion, more people in America felt like their religion was similar than it did before, right? If you went to South Carolina, you would have met a bunch of Anglicans. There could have been a few Methodists and Baptists, but most people would have been Anglicans, Episcopalians. By the end of the 1740s, you can go all the way up and down the East Coast, and you'll meet revivalistic evangelicals who maybe don't even know what denomination they are, but they know that they have had an experience that they feel that they've been saved by God and that they have a purpose, and that purpose kind of ties them together. And the other thing that really shines through the Great Awakening, and you'll read it in Whitefield's sermon, is he says there's no classes in heaven or hell. There's no you had more property or you had more a bigger house. It doesn't matter in the final judgment. And this kind of idea that everyone's created equal before God ties right in with the ideas of Locke that all men are created equal. Well, yeah, because at the judgment, according to Whitefield and Edwards, everyone will be equal, regardless of what you did on earth or what station you had.
And in a lot of ways, this Great Awakening is going to lay some of the foundation for the revolution.
Right, and it's almost like you knew that's what we were going to talk about today. So, up to 1754, everything's going pretty smoothly. We have a couple of conflicts, very small conflicts, like Queen Anne's War, King George's War, early in the 1700s. But those are
War of Jenkins' Ear.
The War of Jenkins' Ear. Would you like to talk about the War of Jenkins' Ear briefly?
I would. It is. It's quite fascinating. It occurred off the coast of Georgia, near the Caribbean, and a captain was taken aboard a ship. Spanish ship, and had his ear sliced off and said, "Take this back home to your king, whom I would serve in like fashion if he were here." So the guy shows up to the king with a shriveled ear in his hand with the story, and a war ensues.
So it really brings into perspective the politics of colonial powers in the 1700s. That there was basically a constant conflict between France, Spain, and Great Britain during the 1700s, really during the 1600s as well. But just constant conflict, but small conflicts. Things that were really important were not happening in North America, or at least battles that were going to determine who was going to be in charge of European affairs were not happening in North America up to this point.
Correct.
They were happening in Europe,
yes.
right? So there are some enormous political changes happening in Europe due to wars, huge wars. As we mentioned, Queen Anne's War would be the War of Spanish Succession, where the French and the British would battle it out over who was going to be the king of Spain. The War of Polish Succession, and then finally the War of Austrian Succession. That's really where we see the seeds of the 7 Years' War, or what we'll call the French and Indian War, come about. But it's important to remember it's always France versus England. England and France are not going to be on the same side in any conflict until after the Napoleonic Wars in 1800s, 1815. So in 1754, the French have some forts in the Ohio River Valley, and that land is claimed by the British. So the British send this guy and this unknown kind of, Virginia planter and
22 years
soldier,
old.
George Washington. They send him up to Pennsylvania, really close to what's now modern day Pittsburgh. And they say, look, go up there to this fort and tell the French to get out. And he's like, okay. So he goes and he tells them to get out, and they tell him no. So he comes back, and they give him an army, a small army, a very small contingent of troops. And they say, okay, go back and tell them we mean it. You have to get out. So he goes back, and he tells them to get out, and they still don't want to. So he tries to dislodge them. This becomes the first battle of what will become known as the French and Indian War. And of course, he wins the initial engagement. He loses the initial engagement, and he falls back and builds a fort called Fort Necessity, which was, very small, not really very much protection, a small wooden fort. He finally has to surrender, and he's forced to kind of go back to Virginia in defeat. But weirdly, when he gets back to Virginia, the governor of Virginia kind of congratulates him for his bravery, and he, from that point, is kind of seen as a good leader and a brave man, even though he failed in his attempt to dislodge the French. Now, over the next decade, this war will turn into the largest conflict fought between the colonial powers in North America. So there are some big stories that come out of this. Most famously, the Battle of Fort William Henry becomes the scene for James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, which is, of course, fiction, historical fiction, but it becomes one of the best-selling novels of the 1800s, and it was based on the French and Indian War, the kind of American memory of the French and Indian War. So why is it called the French and Indian War? Are the French fighting the Native Americans? Here's a trick question that you might be able to answer. Which side were the Native Americans on in the French and Indian War?
Answer, both.
Both, right. So explain that to us. How does that work?
Well, there were tribes that were loyal to the British and saw them as the power that we're going to win, so they joined their side. And there were a larger contingent of Indians that were on the French side, and they were looking for any help they could get to drive the British out of North America, because the British were the greater threat than the French. There were many times more British people in North America than French. France never had more than 75,000 people in North America. So right by this time, there's millions of British people. So the Indians want the British out. So the major Indian alliance is Wildwow with the French, but they were on both sides, which does make it kind of confusing.
Right. And the French, they never had the population that the British did because they were mainly here just to trade.
They were.
And so it was important to them that they weren't going to actually set up certain larger settlements like Quebec, Montreal, but they weren't here to create the types of places that we see in New England, like Boston, or
the British were here to create a New England.
Right.
They called it New France, but those guys never saw this as a final destination. It was just a place to do business.
Mm-hmm. Right. So after this conflict, it drags on for 10 years. There are very few real large engagements. Mainly, it is dislodging the French from the Ohio Valley. These battles that we talk about aren't really what we see as like pitched battles. They're more sieges of forts. And the British slowly work their way up the Ohio Valley, dislodging the French from these forts until they get to Canada, what's modern-day Canada, and the fall of Quebec kind of becomes the end of the French and Indian War. So the British win. And that seems like a really great thing for the colonies, right? They no longer have this French threat and the French kind of encouraging native tribes to attack them. But there are some problems that start to result from the end of the French and Indian War. First, France is forced to cede all of its possessions east of the Mississippi River to England, right? That's a huge area, a massive area. And this forces Britain to have to reorganize their imperial strategy. The way that they are going to handle the colonies is different now. And so we'll go ahead and look at this. But before we go, the end of salutary neglect, right? Because they have to reorganize the territories and pay for the war, no longer are the colonies going to get to do their own thing. This is now important to the Parliament of Great Britain that they get their debts paid off, that the colonists start to respect the borders that they create, because it costs money to protect them from native tribes, right? So the first thing they do is they draw the proclamation line of 1763. The proclamation line of 1763. What does that proclamation say?
It says there'll be no settlement westward of that line, which that line was not a straight line. It ran the length of the Appalachian Mountains.
Right. So it basically says no one is allowed to settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains in British North America. Well, at the time they drew it, nobody was over there already, right?
No. They were right to it, but not across.
Okay. So if there was anyone who was beyond it, they were kind of pioneers.
They were.
More explorers than settlers. So this is the first thing that really bothers the colonists, because they're being told now that this imaginary line drawn 3,000 miles away in some palace somewhere is going to stop them from expanding. And as we know, they were already seeing the problems with the distribution of land by the end of the 1600s with Bacon's Rebellion, right? Mm-hmm. Poorer people were already pushing west, more and more west, in order to get better and better land, because all the good land in the Piedmont and the Tidewater regions was already taken by the wealthy aristocracy, right? So now, in order to pay for the war, the British are also going to start to do something they've never done before. Before, they had instituted taxes or navigation laws, is what they called them, in the 1600s, that basically said, well, you can't trade with anybody but us. And nobody had a problem with that, because the thing about that was you could just lie and smuggle in what you needed and say you were just trading with Great Britain, even though you were trading with other people as well. Well, these are different, because these are not acts that say that the colonies can only trade with Great Britain. They actually tax the goods, right? And so let's talk about these. The first one's in 1764, and it's the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act. Why sugar? what's the deal? Why is sugar this important thing? In America today, you can go buy a pound of sugar. Well, I don't know how much it is, probably like, what, $5? Why is sugar the first thing that they decide to tax?
Well, it was a widely grown item in the Western Hemisphere, in the West Indies, that region, and it was very important to their diet.
Okay, so the Sugar Act's first. Everybody uses sugar, so if you're going to use this sugar, you have to pay this tax. This doesn't sit well with British colonists. The next one is going to be the Stamp Act in 1765, and this one goes even further, and it taxes paper. Right? If you want to send a letter, Stamp Act tax. You want to write a will, Stamp Act. You want to draft any legal document, Stamp Act. Anything that you want to do,
Buy a newspaper.
You have to pay the Stamp Act tax. And this was something that people were not used to this in America. They were not used to paying taxes upon receipt of goods.
Mm-hmm.
They were used to taxes being paid by merchants at ports of entry, and that cost was just shuffled on down the line to them, and they just paid for those import duties, but they never really knew it. I mean, they knew it, but they didn't see it on their receipt, right? But now when they buy something, they're like, 2 pounds and 10 shillings. Well, what's this 10 shillings? Oh, that's the tax I'm paying to the king. Well, I've never had to do this before. What the heck, right? And then finally, now the Stamp Act is actually repealed because all of the, one of the most dangerous jobs in colonial America was probably tax collector.
No doubt.
What would happen to you if you were a little bit overzealous with your tax collecting?
Well, popular punishment was tar and feathering.
Okay.
Riding you out of town on a rail.
Right. They would cover you with tar, then throw feathers at you, and then tie you to a fence post and run you out of town, right? And sometimes they threatened to kill people, and that was how deeply they felt like these taxes were not legal. They genuinely they didn't feel like they were bad policy. They felt like it was not constitutional for them. And we'll get to what we mean by constitutional. There is no United States Constitution, but Great Britain has a constitution called common law, right? And they believe that it's against the common law of Great Britain for them to be taxed when they do not have representation in Parliament, okay? And finally, the townshend duties. This is a group of taxes that it's 3 or 4 different taxes that are placed on the colonies in 1767, and it kind of pushes it over the edge.
Yeah, it's taxes on lead, glass, paint, and of course tea. But you talk about lead, glass, paint, anything made of or having lead, glass, paint in it, pretty much a tax on every item.
Yeah,
every manufactured good would have that stuff.
Right, and in the past, they would say, well, we don't want to import sugar from England. Well, we'll grow our own. We'll smuggle it from the Indies, from the French West Indies. Mm-hmm. Well, the Stamp Act, and you'll read in this module the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, John Dickinson. He writes, well, we can't make our own paper. There's only like 2 mills in all of America. We can't make our own glass. He says that these are things we can't make. We have to buy them from Great Britain, right? So this kind of cry of taxation without representation becomes the starting point of the real breakdown between the British colonists and the home country. And that taxation without representation idea is put forward by John Dickinson in his Letters from a Farmer, where he basically argues that the internal affairs of the colonies, taxation within the colonies, can only be legislated by the colonies. That trade within the empire can be kind of overseen by England, but that taxation within the colonies can only be legislated by the colonies because they have no representation in Parliament. Now, one thing they don't really ever bring up is that there were plenty of towns in England that had no, for instance, Birmingham, England, was a quickly growing city in England. It had 0 representatives in Parliament, right? There were cities in England that had 0 representatives. In fact, this is a fun fact. There was a town on the west coast of England that actually over time fell into the sea. It fell into the sea, okay, throughout the Middle Ages. In 1776, that town still had a representative in Parliament. So let's not act like representation was perfect in England either. And here's another thing. Representation in England was not direct representation. It was what they called virtual representation. So for instance, you didn't have to be from a town to represent that town. So you could live in York in the north of England, and you could represent a town on the southwestern coast in Kent. You didn't have to be from that area. Like in the United States, we take for granted that if you're going to run for Congress, you have to live in that area. That wasn't true in England. And also it was just not the case that people listen to their constituents. They didn't have their constituents were the entire British people. That's what they thought. And they called it virtual representation. Well, that idea does not sit well with American colonists. They say, we don't care for your virtual representation. I want actual representation, right? So 1770, all this boils over. The Quartering Act of 1765 puts troops in Boston. And this grinds on the inhabitants of Boston, and they get tired of seeing these British soldiers in their town all the time. And it boils over in 1770, the Boston Massacre. What happens during the Boston Massacre?
Well, New England, specifically Massachusetts, more specifically Boston, is the hotbed of revolutionary activity. There's revolutionists all over the place there that are against the British. And this influx of British troops around this time to basically protect the custom houses and the tax collectors. It's going to come to a head March 5th, 1770, with what started off as a snowball fight. A couple of teenage boys balls into a full-scale protest where British soldiers are called to the customs house to oppose the crowd, which has grown to a couple hundred. They do have clubs, and they're throwing rocks and shells and whatever they get their hands on. So it's not quite a peaceful protest anymore, even by today's standards. Not a peaceful protest. And a British soldier fires a shot, and a volley of shots ring out, and 14 people lay on the ground. 9 wounded, and 5 will die. The first being Crispus Attucks, who they call the first casualty of the American Revolution.
And he was an African-American man.
He was a free black man.
Free black man, the first casualty of the American Revolution. So now, weirdly, another great American figure that we'll talk about later, John Adams, will represent the soldiers in court, and they will be exonerated. He actually argues that they feared for their lives, and so their firing into the crowd was the least use of force that they felt like they could use to disperse the crowd and save their own lives. Because I think it's, reading accounts of it, he was probably right. They probably would have killed them because the crowd kept growing, and they kept getting more and more raucous. They probably would have killed, someone was going to get killed. So John Adams actually represents those soldiers, and they're exonerated. So 1773, the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So what happens in the Boston Tea Party?
Well, the British East India Company, a fledgling British company, is having trouble selling their tea. Of course, most of the tea's been boycotted since the Townshend duties taxed it in 1767. So it's, and the colonists have been boycotting British tea, but they've been smuggling in tea from abroad, from other places. And so the British, in order to help this struggling company of theirs, are going to allow tea to be brought in and sold to the colonists at a very low price. And some of the this doesn't set well with some of the colonists, especially the tea smugglers, who's going to lose business because of this. There's in these years since the Boston Massacre, there's been a group of Bostonians that have formed I call them a terrorist organization, the Sons of Liberty.
Mm-hmm. Samuel Adams.
Yes, Samuel Adams.
Probably the most famous.
The Sons of Liberty. And they're going to have the idea that they're not going to allow anyone to buy this British tea. They're going to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to dress up as Mohawk Indians. They're going to board these British ships. They're going to hack open the chest of tea. They're going to dump it into the harbor.
Right. And they do that. And it's probably the worst kept secret in all of Boston. Like probably everyone in Boston knows this is going to happen. They're dressed up like Native Americans, which when was the last time there was a Native American raid on Boston, specifically for tea, right? No, yes. They didn't do anything else, just the tea. This is actually a huge amount of money that they dump into Boston Harbor. I mean,
millions of dollars, modern day
the
money.
Equivalent of, if you, it's the equivalent of like if you went into IBM and smashed up a server room. Like that's the way we would look at it now. This was a huge cost all at once. I mean, it
could not be overlooked.
Right. It was an amount of money that could not be overlooked by the British. And they introduced the Intolerable Acts, which they'd already introduced the Quartering Act, which allowed British troops to be quartered in Boston. They had already had the Declaratory Act, which said, hey, we're going to repeal some of these acts, some of these taxes, but remember, we're in charge, right? We have total sovereignty over you. The intolerable acts are a little bit different. There's the Boston Harbor Act, which closes Boston Harbor, right? All of these people in Boston are making their money by being merchants. Boston Harbor is now closed. No goods are coming in and out of Boston Harbor. It also punishes the state of Massachusetts by only allowing the Crown to choose officials, so that there are no more elections held in the state, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Crown Colony of Massachusetts. Anything else?
Yeah, well, the reinstitution of the Quartering Act was huge. It's interesting to note that the British didn't call it the Intolerable Acts. That was the colonists' name for it. The British called it the Coercive Acts. You've forced us. You've coerced us to do this to you. And they were punishments. The colonists will call them, the Intolerable Acts. They can't take it.
Right. And once again, this kind of punishment of New England, at the time, the Southern colonies are doing fine. I mean, there's no great outcry in Charleston for a revolution. There's no tea being dumped into Charleston Harbor. This is a very New England phenomenon. The beginning of the revolution is very much a New England phenomenon that will spread south, and we'll see that a little later. So we are in 1774. The Intolerable Acts have been passed. Trade is cut off. Massachusetts is now pretty much an occupied territory, right? It is now pretty much considered an enemy of Great Britain, and it's being occupied, right? So what is considered the first real battle of the Revolutionary War, Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, will be fought in April of 1775. And this is just correct me if I'm wrong, this is just a huge battle where there are thousands of people, right?
Not so much. Lexington is where the first shots will be fired. And, you had about 80 Minutemen versus about 700 British soldiers, but this was a skirmish at best. Right.
This is not a big battle. It is not a set piece battle.
One volley, really.
Yeah. They literally fire once and run.
Yeah.
Now, they do harass the British on their way back to Boston, but this is not a battle in the way that we think of a
little bit
battle.
Larger conflict at Concord. Of course, more Minutemen had gathered there to protect the
armory.
The armory.
So really, we get the first real kind of consequential battle of the Revolutionary War in June of 1775 at the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, outside of Boston. And what does this battle tell? What does it have to say to the colonists and to the British alike. It has clearly different. It means different things to both sides. So I would say to the British, it tells them that the colonists are not going to be easy to dislodge. They're not a rabble. They're not just going to run away. They're not scared of the redcoats. What does it tell the colonists?
Well, the colonists inflict 4 casualties to the British for every one of theirs. So to them, they get a lot of confidence. It's kind of like a moral victory for them. They're going to lose the hill. Of course, taking the ground is how you win battles in those days. They will retreat off the hill. They'll lose the hill. They'll lose the battle, but they will gain immense confidence that, hey, we can do this. These guys aren't invincible.
Right. And so the Battle Bunker Hill becomes an American legend, and it convinces the colonists that they can actually fight back and win. So in 1776, in January, 1776 is a huge year for the American Revolution, obviously because of the Declaration of Independence, but even more than that, the Siege of Boston, right? And George Washington retakes Boston. They bring in heavy guns that they've taken from Fort Ticonderoga, which was another great American victory, and they bring in these siege mortars and they siege Boston and they take it away from the British. The British are forced to flee by ship, and just before that, Thomas Paine has published his Common Sense, his pamphlet Common Sense. What does the pamphlet Common Sense tell the fledgling American people?
Well, first of all, it gives some of the ideas that are needed to fight. It gives common sense reasons, just things you should know without having to be told, of why the American colonies should be independent of British rule. It also is a call to arms. It is a call to arms.
Right, and it's the most circulated piece of literature in the American Revolutionary era.
Bestseller of its time.
Right, the bestseller of its time. It is republished and republished and republished, and by the end of the Revolution, 1781, I would say that most people in America had read it. They had, if not read it, they had definitely heard of it. They were familiar with it. So the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia, and they draft and write the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is really two things. I would break it down into two things. The first thing it is the preamble to it is a statement of what the colonists believe about humanity and government and how government should be administered. And we get the famous lines, Jefferson says, when in the course of human events, you have to dissolve the bonds between two people, right? He's basically quoting from John Locke there when John Locke says, well, once the government is detrimental to the people have the right to dissolve that government. And so we see these Enlightenment ideas just coming straight out in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the dissolution of the bonds between England and the colonies, and then, of course, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, that is the most Enlightenment statement made in the course of the Revolution. And it lays it out right there. It says something that has not been said in a founding document for any country ever, that the basis of the country is everyone's equal. Right now, of course, there are huge problems with that. There are big problems with that we'll talk about later. But this sets the world on fire. I mean, it is the beginning of the most tumultuous time in history, really. Afterwards, with the French Revolution, and this is really the beginning of it. But at the time, when they wrote this, did they sit down and say, well, it looks like we're going to win for sure, so we might as well write this Declaration of Independence? It was actually a redress of grievances, right? It was addressed to the king, and it was telling him all the things he had done wrong and why they were fighting. And it asked him, if you just stop doing these things, maybe we could reconcile. Were they sure they were going to win at this point?
Oh, they were losing, and losing badly. I say this all the time in class. I mean, if July 4th would just be another day if we'd lost that war, because when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, it was not looking good for the American colonists.
Right. It was
You know?
looking bad. And, Washington tells the Continental Congress in early 1776, they say, what's our strategy? And he says, avoid battle. He said, we are not ready for, he said, if we engage in an open engagement with the British, we'll be destroyed. Right. So he actually has this strategy of run away, maneuver, don't allow them to catch the Continental Army in the open, or it may be the end of it. And then in December of 1776, Washington does something that most commanders would never have done. Some say out of a stroke of genius, some say from desperation. Winter was not the campaigning season. Battles were generally fought in spring and summer, fall sometimes, but winter, battles were usually not fought in the winter unless they were absolutely forced. Commanders at this time especially did not like to fight in the winter because logistically it was impossible.
It was a nightmare.
You couldn't supply your troops because roads were just ruined. The cold was hard on animals, which were doing most of the work, horses, oxen, things like that. Firearms didn't work the way they were supposed to when it was too cold and damp. But Washington has this idea that he's going to cross over the Delaware River on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And kind of what happens when he does this?
Well, like you talked about before, he doesn't want to directly attack the British. So he's going to attack a small detachment of British and Hessian troops.
Germans, right?
Yes. At Trenton, which was kind of the midway point between Philadelphia and New York, where the main British armies camped for the winter in New York. Mm-hmm. They've taken over New York earlier. And so Washington will cross the Delaware River, which separates Pennsylvania and New Jersey, across the Delaware River under the cover of night. And he will surprise the British. They were totally surprised by this. And he's going to win a major victory there. And this is part of his genius. He attacks, he does things to keep his men's morale high. Mm-hmm. And they needed that bad at that point. They had just lost the battle in New York, almost got totally destroyed in October of 76. And now he gets the morale boost they need. Right.
And really what he does is Trenton and then later Princeton, the Battle of Princeton, were important because those were the places that were supplying the British Army in New York. Mm-hmm. They were supply depots. And so he takes out the supplies of the main British field army. And now the British field army can't just sit in New York and wait for him to give battle. They're going to have to do something, right? And of course, they decide to invade the colonies from Canada. And this is where we get the turning point of the war, this invasion of, it was General Burgoyne and Howe, and they had two different armies. And the British in England, the Parliament, they are under the impression that Burgoyne and Howe are going to work together. Burgoyne and Howe were under the impression that they were both in charge and they were going to do what they wanted, right? So there's just this comedy of errors between these two commanders, and it ends in the Battle of Saratoga, which actually there were quite a few engagements and then a final victory for the Americans on October 17th, 1777, with Horatio Gates being the kind of the commanding officer at the battle for the Americans, but really the hero of the battle, an unlikely hero. If you've ever heard the name, it was
Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold, the man who will later be a turncoat and try to give up the West Point to the British. But
ironically, the victory that he will secure will lead him to trading sites.
Right, because he feels like he's been slighted, that he is not given command of an army after his actions at Saratoga. But Saratoga is not just a military victory. It is more importantly a strategic political victory, because what is going on at this time that the Americans really need in order to actually have a chance of winning this war?
Well, we need foreign help. And ever since, the Declaration of Independence is important for a lot of reasons, but this was our declaration to the world that we were an independent country. And by being an independent country, we can seek alliances, and we send over one of our best negotiators to what country would like nothing better than to have a victory over the British. That would be France. So we're going to send over our best negotiator. His name's Benjamin Franklin. They love him in France. They love him. He's a rock star in France. French people see Americans as kind of backwoods country people. He wears around a coonskin cap everywhere. They love him.
Yeah.
But they're not about to get involved in another war with the British. They just, a generation ago, lost 2 wars to them. Right. So that now they're, but Franklin's trying everything. Finally, the Battle of Saratoga happens. A much larger British army is defeated by the Americans. And this kind of opens the French eyes. They say, wait a minute. If they can do this well on their own, imagine if they did have our help. And so they're going to make a treaty of alliance with the United States following this. And it's going to be definitely the turning point of this war.
Right. The turning point. It's mainly the French Navy that we need. We don't have a Navy. It doesn't matter how many victories we win on land, as long as the British rule the coast and as long as the British can keep importing supplies and troops, there's nothing we can do. Once we have the assurance of the French that they will bring their Navy into play, now the British are in trouble because they have to not only worry about the land operations, but now they're being harassed at sea by the French. So even though we get this huge turning point in 1777, the winter of 1777-78 is possibly the lowest point for the American army at Valley Forge. After the fall of Philadelphia, this is the seat of the Continental Congress. They have to up and move, run away, and Philadelphia falls, and George Washington winters his army in Valley Forge, and it's brutal. It's cold. There's not enough food. They lack supplies, and while they're experiencing all these deprivations, Washington brings in these French officers, the Marquis de Lafayette, especially, and he says, "Look, you need to train your army. This army has got spirit, but it's not trained. It needs to be trained." So, in the midst of all of this, not enough food. It's too cold. They don't have proper encampments, things like that. They're training nonstop for the coming year of battle, which they know will decide whether they get to be free or not. Well, after the winter at Valley Forge, the British say, look, we're tired of fighting in New England, the middle colonies. We've lost every, not every major battle that we fought, but Washington is a hard nut to crack.
They're not gaining ground.
Right. We're not gaining anything. What we need is a different strategy. So what they do is they send a very highly decorated officer, Lord Cornwallis, to Charleston with an army. Charleston falls, and they assume that the South will be much easier to dominate because they have much more loyalist tendencies. It's not a hotbed of revolution, or so they think. And in 1780, we see this southern plan of the British start to come to fruition. They win a victory at the Battle of Camden and destroy an American army there in South Carolina. But then there's a little-known turning point. It's known to historians, little known by the American people, the Battle of Kings Mountain. Tell us a little bit about the Battle of Kings Mountain.
Kings Mountain sits right there on the border of North South Carolina today, not too far from Charlotte. To me, this is one of the most intriguing battles of this war because it doesn't involve regular armies. Mm-hmm. Of course, after the defeat at Camden, the Americans kind of turned to the militia, their part-time soldiers. They call them into battle, the farmers, and it's theirs. You now have to keep the British from moving north to trap Washington. That's their goal. But this Battle of Kings Mountain will be a battle between. It's almost like a civil war within this revolution. colonial militia versus British loyalists. Loyalists being American colonists that were loyal to the king, loyal to the British. They will fight at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And this battle will be called the turning point in the South.
Mm-hmm. And one of the commanders at this battle is famously from Washington County, Virginia, William Campbell. He takes a contingent of men to this battle, and he serves valiantly, and he is promoted within the Continental ranks. He will fight again at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which will actually be a victory for the British, but it's a costly victory. And so we see the British losing at the Battle of Kings Mountain. They then lose because of the chaos of the Battle of Kings Mountain and the loss of some of their better officers in that battle. The Battle of Cowpens really becomes this eye-opening moment for Cornwallis that he's not going to be able to just come in and dominate. After the Battle of Camden, he believed he was going to dominate in the South. He now sees that's not the case. He retires up the coast to Virginia, to Yorktown, slowly, and there are battles fought along the way, but he slowly retires to the coast, hoping that his army can be saved by the British Navy, right? Well, he gets to Yorktown, and he looks out, a bit of a dramatization here, but you can imagine he gets to Yorktown, he garrisons his army in Yorktown, he looks out into Chesapeake Bay, and he says, those flags on those ships, they don't look like the Union Jack. And they're like, yeah, that's because those are all French ships, right? So the French finally come in good at Yorktown by blockading the port. The ability of the British Navy to evacuate the army from Yorktown is neutralized by the French, and there's a siege, and of course, this is the virtual end of the conflict. Cornwallis surrenders to Washington. He's actually so embarrassed that he doesn't go himself. He sends his second in command to give up his sword, and at this point, the war is effectively over. The British start to. There are a few other engagements, but the British begin to remove their troops from the continent.
Yeah, the victory at Yorktown is the end of the war, but it didn't have to be. I mean, we didn't totally defeat. I mean, they still had a major army
in the north. Yeah,
I mean, the British could have continued to fight, but this, wars sometimes are not won on the battlefield as much as in with the public.
Yeah,
and
hearts and minds.
The British public were over it.
Right. I've heard it, and we could talk about this for hours, but and we're trying to wrap up a little bit. But I've heard it called that the revolution was Britain's Vietnam. It was a war that they never should have lost. They had the most powerful navy and possibly one of the most powerful armies in the world at the time. It was a war they just could. It was a war they never should have lost, but a war they couldn't win. And I think that what we see as like the reaction of the American people to Vietnam was much the same reaction that the British people had to the American Revolution. They were like, why are we there? Like we're losing men, we're losing resources. We have other things we could be doing, we could be focusing on. Now, of course, losing the colonies was an economic loss for sure in certain ways. But once the American colonies were rebuilt and were in full economic development, it was probably a boon to the British that they had another trading partner, because after the war is over, we pretty quickly patch things up. It's a bumpy road for a while, but they become our greatest trading partner pretty fast after the revolution. So really quickly, and these are things that we're going to have to cover in the next episode on the Constitution of the early national period, but this brings into mind for these people these really hard questions, like what does it mean to be free? That they're talking about freedom, that they're fighting for their quote unquote freedom, but they own slaves, right? What does slavery mean? They say, well, we're going to be slaves to Great Britain. But, Patrick Henry, in his speech that you'll read and hear during this module, he says, is peace so sweet to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery, right? And everyone in that room probably that he was speaking to owned slaves, right? And he was saying, oh, how terrible it would be to be a slave. So what does freedom mean? What does slavery mean? And you can draw on the Edmund Morgan reading from the previous module for this as well, because he talks about it, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, owned slaves, right? After the war, is this going to be a loose confederation? I mean, of course, we'll talk about this in the next module, but they form a federal government, a loose confederation of states in 1781, right? But each state still has their own money. Each state still has their own militia. Each state still makes their own laws and makes their own treaties with other states, with trade and things like that. How's this going to work? Is it going to be one nation, or is it going to be a bunch of states? And then another thing to think about is what makes the American Revolution different. Why is it different? Why is it a turning point in world history? Why is it a watershed moment? So any just closing thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of people think when you think about the term revolution, people think a violent overthrow or something. Actually, a revolution means a great change. There's going to be a great change that takes place following this. Any kind of revolution, there follows. There's a great change that follows. It's going to be a great change. It's going to be a great change to the world, a great change to this country.
All right, and like I said, we're going to cover some of these big questions on this slide in the next module with the Constitution, and these will be tough questions they have to answer. I know this podcast ran a little bit longer than the previous ones, but this is a huge topic, and it's so important to the understanding of American history that we are going to have to wrap up here, and we'll see you next week.